The next effect that I want to talk about is sweep effects. And what we're going to do is go into the media browser, and we're either going to add an audio file from these source files. In the sample library folder, there's the sweep effects sample. So we're going to add that, and this is just a sweep effect from the sample library. And then we're going to add that onto a new track. We're going to place it at bar 5. All right, and let's go ahead and solo that and take a listen to it. All right, so that is a little sweep effect that kind of fades out as it hits. So let's go ahead and close the media browser. And what we're going to do is listen to this in the mix. And this is a great kind of sound effect to add, again, to introduce a new section or keep things interesting throughout the arrangement. So let's listen. All right, so it's very loud and it's dry. So before we do anything, let's kind of process this. And so again, we'll solo it. And kind of a standard EQ chain will be a high pass filter, again at around 150 Hertz. Then another delay. We use a lot of delays. It's probably one of the most widely used effect, especially in remixes and electronic music, because you can get away with a lot of these more delayed and wet style effects. So on a crash like this, I want to put it in a really fast delay time. So we're going to put it on the 16th note. I'm going to start it again around 50% and the wet at about 25%. So let's listen to that. And it just gives it a nice tail at the end. Next, I want to put a flanger after that, and that's going to give it some modulation and just some more character. So we're going to lower the mix to about 36%. Right, 35, 36%, and take a listen. There we go, maybe a little bit less. Let's go 25%. There we go, nice and subtle, but it gives it some nice character. And last but not least, we will add really gentle compression to just bring it out in the mix. So again, we'll do a little slower attack, about 9 milliseconds. Medium release, maybe 170 milliseconds. Ratio, we'll do about 2 to 1, and again, lower the threshold until we get about 2 or 3 dB of gain reduction. So a little bit more. There we go. Great, so now let's unsolo it and bring it into the mix. A little bit lower. Okay, so I'm going to move this first sweep effect down to bar 1. Then I'm going to hold down Option and copy it again at bar 5. And this sweep effect obviously goes from loud and then fades out. And what I'm going to do is this actually can be 2 effects in the same track using the same sample. So what we're going to do is select the copy that we just made, and because both of these regions are referencing the same audio file, before we process this further, I want to make a copy of this. So what we're going to do is come up to the local menu of the Arrange page, and I'm going to go Convert Regions to New Audio Files. And with that region selected, I can now call this Sweep Effects. For example, we'll just name it Sweep Effects 2. And I'll click Save, and it creates a new copy of this region. So it's a brand new audio file. And if we go over to the media browser, you can see this is the first effect, and that's the one we just made a copy of. And what this is going to do is allow us to process it inside the sample editor. So what I'm going to do is come into the sample editor, and in this functions list, I'm going to come down here, and there's a whole list of processing things we can do, like normalize, which would make it as loud as possible, up to 0 dB, fade in, fade out, and there's also reverse right down here. So if I click reverse, it reverses that effect. And before we get out of here, notice the timeline in the sample editor. You can see that bar 5 starts right at the beginning of this region, and bar 6 is just beyond. And we want to make sure that this sweep effect comes up, and right when it gets as loud as possible is right on the downbeat. So we're going to use this to sweep up into a new section. Now the way to do this, up to this point, we've been adjusting these regions down here with this blue region bar. But above that, in the sample editor, notice this little orange triangle here, and to the left of it, it says anchor. And what we're going to do is grab this anchor point, and when I put my mouse over it, you can see the mouse goes into a little finger. And what I'm going to do is click that, and as I drag it, notice the timeline is moving. And only the timeline moves, but the region stays the same length below. So as I drag this, I'm going to drag bar 5 over to be right at the end of that sample. So now you can notice in the arrange page, as I do that, it moves the region around. So if I drag this back, notice it's adjusting the region inside the arrange page. So let's bring this back so that this sweep effect ends right at bar 5. Let's come out of the sample editor and let's take a listen. So at bar 1, I've moved the original sweep down, so we're going to get kind of a crash style sweep, and then it's going to sweep up and introduce bar 5. Cool, so it's pretty much 2 sweep effects with different sounds using the same sample with just a little bit different processing. We can also create sweeping effects not only from the use of samples like we just took a look at, but actually using a noise generator. And what we can do is add a software instrument. We'll create that track. And actually, in the input of that track, we can come down here to test oscillator. What we're going to do is bring up a stereo test oscillator. We're going to immediately bypass it, and the first thing that comes up by default is a test tone. And you can use this to calibrate your system or get signal, but as one of the presets, there's actually white noise and pink noise. So for example, if we select the pink noise and unbypass it, that gives you that standard staticky noise. And what we're going to do is create a sound effect with this. So before we unbypass that again, let's look at the signal chain that I used to process this. And starting to see some really common trends here. And the first one is this high pass filter. And now in the pink noise, there's a lot of low end. So we're going to scoop this out at about 170, just under 200 hertz. And we might even decide to put a high shelf around 10K, and that'll bring out some of the high end. And sometimes I'll remove some around 300 or 400 hertz, which usually is a common place that we find muddiness in our mix. So in the case of the white noise, sometimes I'll remove that, and I've taken out about 7 dB around 420. All right. So if we bring back up the test oscillator, we can listen to that. All right. If I bring up the EQ, we can now bypass the EQ, and you hear the difference. So let me pull the fader down, and we'll unbypass the EQ. The next thing we'll use is again a flanger, a slight flanger, which again will give some modulation and movement to that sound. So there's with the flanger, and I'll lower this to about 29 or 30%. Okay. Next, we're going to put in a compressor, and this time what we're going to do is something that's called side chaining. Side chaining is when you take a sound and use it to trigger another external effect or instrument. For example, here what we're going to do is duplicate the kick drum track and use that to trigger a compressor on this pink noise track that we just created. And we're going to do this by turning on an external input or key input of the compressor. And this causes the threshold, which is what would normally trigger the compressor settings, to be ignored, and instead the compressor will react to that external input, in this case the kick drum track. The end result is that it gives our pink noise an added pumping or breathing effect that can not only sound really cool, but ends up being very musical as well. So to achieve this side chaining effect, the first thing we're going to do is duplicate the kick down to a new track and use that as the external trigger on the compressor. So we're going to add a stereo audio track, and then I'm going to copy down, hold down Option, drag this down, and copy the kick. And we want to make sure it's running throughout the whole track. What I'm also going to do is bring up my text tool and rename this as the side chain. That way I'll know that that region is simply for the side chain. Now, one very important thing we need to do on this side chain kick track is to set the output to no output. And what that's going to do is take the signal out of the master bus, so we won't be actually hearing it in our mix, because all we want to use this track for is to trigger the compressor on the pink noise track. So if we bring up the compressor, notice in the upper right hand corner it says sidechain. And right now it's set to none. And this sidechain track that we just created is on audio 21. So if I name that, I can call that sidechain. And then if I come back to the pink noise track and pull up the compressor, I can come down here, audio 21, sidechain. And I'm going to set that as the input of the sidechain. And as we bring up the pink noise, what I'm going to do is solo both of these tracks. And as we bring up the level on the pink noise, you'll hear the compressor start to react from this kick drum that we duplicated. And to make it more drastic, what we can do is increase the ratio and lower the attack and make it a really fast attack. And now you can really start to hear it pump and breathe with the mix. Now right now we're going to leave it, and what we can do is unsolo this and listen in the mix, and we've got these other effects, but if we mute these, we can start to also hear this optional pink noise sweep effect, and we're going to automate that later. We're not going to do it now because we want to wait to figure out where we're going to need it in the arrangement, but what we can do is play the track and use this as another effect. Just like that, and sweep it in and out, and we can later on automate that, but now it's just a really great option.